There have been disappearances throughout history that are so impactful they spawn legends for generations to come, and they seem impossible to solve. Ships and airplanes with the passengers and crews piloting them. There one minute, calm seas and clear skies, gone the next. And these disappearances remain unsolved not because we lack the evidence to find out what happened, but because the answers may simply not exist. This video is about the most unbelievable disappearances in history, and the Bermuda Triangle kind of, okay? The Bermuda Triangle isn't what you think it is. The U.S. Navy's greatest mystery occurred in early March 1918 when the USS Cyclops departed Barbados with 306 men aboard and vanished completely, leaving behind the U.S. Navy's greatest unsolved mystery and its largest non-combat loss of life. The 542-foot naval collier carrying nearly 11,000 tons of manganese ore, crucial for wartime steel production during World War II, never sent a distress signal, it left no debris, and sparked over a century of investigations that have yielded no definitive answers. And the mystery deepened when post-war examination of German naval records revealed no submarine activity in the area, eliminating the most obvious wartime explanation and leaving investigators with a puzzle that has resisted solution in spite of now modern technology and continuing persistent efforts by the descendants of the lost crew. Believe it or not, the USS Cyclops did not begin its life as a doomed mystery ship, but rather as a vital workhorse of the expanding US Navy. It was commissioned on May 7th, 1910 at William Cramp & Son Shipyard in Philadelphia, my favorite shipyard, and the massive collier represented the Navy's commitment to maintaining coal-powered fleets across global waters, the early 20th century. A collier, by the way, is a type of ship or someone who works with coal. A cargo ship that hauls coal. A collier is coal-related. And at 542 feet long with a 19,360-ton displacement, the Cyclops dwarfed most vessels of its era. It was gigantic. And it was designed specifically, like I said, to carry the enormous coal loads required by battleships and cruisers that were operating far from American ports. This thing was invaluable, carrying coal and maintaining the Navy's expanding presence in the Caribbean, Guantanamo Bay, Abu Ghraib, just kidding. All these areas required constant resupply, especially during wartime, which we entered in 1917. April 1917, that is when the United States of America entered World War I, and the conflict fundamentally transformed the role of auxiliary vessels like the USS Cyclops. They were no longer simple coal carriers supporting peacetime patrols. These ships became the backbone of massive logistics operations that would determine the war's outcome. And if you're unfamiliar with the US of A's game when it comes to logistics, that's how all the wars are ever won, pretty much. Even though they're not actually ever won, they're forever, and then that's how you make money and stuff. That's not how I make money, though. I make money by turning tricks on the street corner. The point is, cargo ships like the USS Cyclops in 1917 and 1918, the importance cannot be overstated. German U-boats had demonstrated their ability to strangle Allied supply lines, sinking merchant vessels faster than shipyards could replace them during the peak of unrestricted submarine warfare. I cannot imagine being on a submarine in the early 20th century. That had to be horrible. For perspective, the German people grew their U-boat fleet from 20 ships in 1914 to 140 by 1917. And with those 140, they would sink 30% of the world's merchant vessels. What in the heck? What a bunch of assholes. And then they did that shit again, dude, in another world war. So the Cyclops and her sister ships found themselves thrust into roles far beyond their original design parameters. While originally intended to carry 10,000 tons of coal in familiar Atlantic waters, they were now expected to transport denser ores over longer distances under wartime pressures. So the required expansion from the Navy had outpaced both shipbuilding capacity and the institutional knowledge needed to safely operate auxiliary vessels like the USS Cyclops, which were now carrying unfamiliar cargoes like manganese. What kind of carbon is that?
What kind of carbon is this?
And so we get to the final journey of the USS Cyclops on January 9th, 1918, departing Norfolk, Virginia with 9,960 tons of coal bound for British warships operating in Brazilian waters. The Cyclops apocalyptic ship arrived without incident to Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, delivering its coal before loading up nearly 11,000 tons of manganese ore, desperately needed to bolster American wartime steel production. So if you pair that hefty load of manganese with the nearly 4,000 tons of water in the ship's hull, the ship sat in the water well above the plimsoll line, which marks safe loading levels. So the Cyclops embarks on a seemingly perilous journey now because of the weight of cargo. On March 3rd, 1918, the overloaded USS Cyclops made an unscheduled stop in Barbados, which was a decision that would provide the last reliable intelligence about the ship's condition and the crew. And the next day, March 4th, the Cyclops set off again for its final leg, a 1,800 nautical mile voyage to the intended destination, which was Baltimore, Maryland. The last transmission ever sent by the USS Cyclops was simple and hopeful, to be honest. Weather fair, all well. Clearly not, though, unfortunately. Weather fair, all well. I love that as being a transmission, especially your last transmission. Everything's great. Wonderful, although the water is above the plimsoll line, but weather fair, all is well. Got a nice tan going. So the Cyclops was expected to arrive in Baltimore by March 13th, but March 13th came and went, and nary a word was heard from the vessel. Worry began to set in, of course. The complete absence of any communication, position updates, no requests for assistance even, and most troubling, no distress signals suggested something far more serious than mechanical problems or even adverse weather had befallen the vessel. By March 15th, worry transformed into alarm, and naval communication stations from Barbados to Norfolk transmitted repeated calls to the Cyclops on multiple frequencies, hoping for any response that might indicate the ship's location and condition. There was complete silence. There were, of course, attempts to locate the ship. The Navy launched a frantic search with destroyers that combed the ocean, but not a single piece of debris was found from the Cyclops. So what could have possibly happened? Perhaps a German U-boat sunk it, or it had been felled by a storm, or crashed somewhere and damaged equipment prevented a call for assistance, but the searches turned up absolutely nothing. And over 300 souls were unaccounted for. People with lives, families, back home that wanted answers. President at the time, Woodrow Wilson, made a statement regarding the disappearance, and it is a statement of inadequacy. He said, "Only God and the sea know what happened to the great ship." And he probably said, "Yeah, see," right after that, because people were weird back then. Then newspapers revealed the disappearance to all of America, who shared in the feeling of loss that these young men on the ship had certainly died. A father of one of the boys aboard the Cyclops even sought to enlist himself after his son's disappearance. And just a few months later, in June of 1918, the Cyclops was declared lost and all hands deceased by Assistant Secretary to the Navy, Franklin D. Roosevelt. So what could have happened to the ship and its crew? Was it a German U-boat? How does something so large go missing with zero evidence left behind? There are several theories. The first theory is that the USS Cyclops carried more than just mechanical vulnerabilities into its final voyage. It sailed under the command of one of the Navy's most controversial captains, a captain by the name of George W. Worley, born Johann Friedrich Georg Weichmann in Germany. He had deserted from a German ship in 1878 and reinvented himself as an American sea captain, so that's pretty suspicious. And reports from sailors indicated that he had created a toxic command climate, and he was nicknamed the Damned Dutchman due to him being a drunkard who mistreated the crew. Worley's sailors and crew were suspicious of him, and theories of mutiny were circulating, but it seems Worley was equally as unhappy with his crew, as he allegedly wrote to the Bureau of Operations for the Navy complaining that his crew were inexperienced, untrained, and that the ship's equipment had become damaged due to their inability to maintain it properly. So, seems like you got a Spider-Man pointing at each other type meme that might apply to this ancient history. So we got theories of mutiny there, and they may have some merit, as there were 5 prisoners in the hold of the ship, some imprisoned due to murder. Even the executive officer was placed under arrest and confined to his quarters over a trivial disagreement where fisticuffs were thrown. And this was a trivial disagreement with the captain, Worley. Can you imagine getting into a trivial disagreement and then going to jail? To the brig! Unfortunately for the crew of the ship, the executive officer who was confined to his quarters was the only officer who had experience loading and storing manganese ore, with the rest of the crew being reportedly inexperienced and untrained That is according to Worley. So another theory is the possibility that the manganese was improperly stored and the dense ore may have resulted in some kind of catastrophic failure that could have split the ship in half, because it is a ship. Just because it's floating doesn't mean it can carry a lot and stuff, and it's still, there's structural integrity, etc., etc. What is this? There is additional weight to the theory that it was improperly loaded and just split in half. It's reported that the ship had a cracked cylinder, which it would have received repairs for upon its arrival in Baltimore, so improper loading or midship loading improperly could have caused it to split and just sink. Additionally, that idea is a speculation from Conrad A. Nervig, a officer that was on the Cyclops but was transferred to off the ship during its stop in Rio de Janeiro. So that level of a witness account holds more weight, like I said. But still, in spite of all that, no debris, no crew, and no remains of the ship have ever been found to confirm or deny any theory. Where this gets into conspiracy territory is that the region the ship believed to have disappeared is right in the heart of the most mysterious and cursed part of the ocean, the Bermuda Triangle. The Triangle is a place that in the decades following the USS Cyclops' disappearance, it would only grow in legend and create fear among those who would travel through it. There have even been modern efforts to locate the Cyclops, employing technology that would have been unimaginable to even the biggest brain genius in 1918. But still, there is nothing found. How is that we have so much stuff. There's drones and CCTV everywhere documenting all of your moves. Advertisers know everything there is to know about you, but we still can't find a shipwreck. We have side scan sonar that can sweep the ocean floor like a fleshlight, creating detailed images of objects even buried in centuries of sediment. There's magnetometers that can detect the magnetic signature of a ship's steel hull from considerable distances. Plus the manganese ore that was cargo of the Cyclops would create quite an anomaly. And you've got remotely operated little submarine ships that sometimes explode. Or implode rather. And these things can sometimes search depths that are inconceivable to researchers in 1918. But still nothing, alas, nothing. Fair weather? Yeah, sure. So the Cyclops continues to elude discovery. It's possible it vanished into thin air. Maybe aliens took it to another dimension. Maybe the Germans took it and, I don't know, sailed it up the Rhine. I don't know, dude, okay? It's possible that the ship is in the Puerto Rican Trench, the deepest part of the Atlantic Ocean. It's 27,000 feet in depth. There's a cool, scary image of it. What a crevice. So the loss of the USS Cyclops is one of the most catastrophic losses of the United States Navy's history, and just a generally catastrophic loss. That's 300 lives never accounted for. But of course, this wouldn't be the first and it wouldn't be the last traverser the Bermuda Triangle has taken down. And by the way, this video is not exactly about the Bermuda Triangle, but it is about things that have disappeared a la Bermuda Triangle style. Flight 19. The Navy's lost bomber group. On December 5th, 1985, 5 TBM Avenger torpedo bombers carrying over a dozen Navy airmen vanished during a routine training flight from the Naval Air Station in Fort Lauderdale, creating one of aviation's most enduring mysteries. Of course, aside from the Malaysian Airlines flight, which we will talk about, by the way. Flight 19's disappearance, building upon the earlier USS Cyclops mystery of 1918, would transform from a tragic military accident into the foundational legend of the Bermuda Triangle. The story of Flight 19 begins with what should have been a straightforward 3-hour navigation exercise over familiar waters, but by nightfall, it had become the catalyst for the largest air-sea search operation in American history up until that point. So how exactly did it happen? Well, Naval Air Station Fort Lauderdale emerged from the swamps of South Florida in 1942. It was built atop the former Merle Fogg civilian airfield to meet the urgent training needs of World War II. And by December of 1945, the war was won, but demobilization had not yet completed. The base continued its dangerous work of transforming raw pilots into skilled naval aviators capable of navigating vast expanses of open ocean. The base specialized in training crews for the Grumman TBM Avenger, a formidable torpedo bomber that had proven its worth in the Pacific Campaign of World War II against the Japanese. These aircraft, powered by Wright R2600 twin cyclone engines producing 1900 horsepower with a max speed of 276 miles per hour, could cruise at 145 miles per hour, the fastest I've ever been in a GTR, with a range of 1,000 miles. Very impressive pieces of flying machines. Show that to the Wright brothers. Yeah! Specifications like that should have made the planned 320-mile training route a routine exercise. That's a consistency among all these unsolved mysteries. Should have been easy, should have been routine, should have been bada bing, bada bing. But Each Avenger carried sophisticated navigation equipment for its time, including iPhones, gyroscopic compasses, radio compasses for homing, and IFF transponders for position identification, not iPhones. Training at Fort Lauderdale was acknowledged as difficult and dangerous, with overwater navigation presenting some fairly unique challenges. And training during this era in general was almost just as dangerous as actual combat. Great Britain lost 8,000 aviators in training accidents, and America lost over 13,000 aviators to training accidents. So very dangerous. So the weather, the day of the exercise, wasn't anything of particular note or worry. There were some scattered showers, but visibility and wind speeds were typical for a training exercise like the one Flight 19 was about to embark on. But what wasn't typical was the late arrival of the instructor pilot assigned to lead the mission. Lieutenant Charles Carroll Taylor, the flight instructor assigned to lead the training mission, arrived only a half hour before the scheduled departure time, despite the student pilots and crew arriving early in the afternoon, which obviously set a bad precedent for the journey ahead. To make matters worse, he even requested to be excused from the training exercise, saying he didn't want to take the flight out because his belly hurt. And for that reason, and the fact that there were no other instructors available, his request was denied. Taylor was a 28-year-old seasoned veteran with over 2,500 flight hours, 600 of which were in the TBM Avenger, and combat experience in the Pacific theater of World War II. This guy was impressive. When his belly hurt, I'm sure it hurt. He was also a former member of Torpedo Squadron 7, where he transitioned to the TBM Avenger and deployed with the USS Hancock before returning to the United States for training command. But in spite of his extensive experience, also casting a shadow on his flight record and this training mission in particular were 3 other occasions he'd become lost, even ditching his plane at sea twice. This fella seemed to have a terrible sense of navigation. The 5 TBM Avengers finally departed at 1410, nearly 30 minutes behind their deadline. And additionally, all 5 aircraft were missing their clocks, which were commonly stolen by aviators as souvenirs to celebrate during peacetime. But the pilots were also supposed to wear watches, so the missing clocks were not considered a no-go. But that is important to note. There were missing instruments on the planes. Flight 19's roster included a mix of experience levels between all 5 3-man crews. FT-28 flight leader pilot Lieutenant Charles Carroll Taylor, the flight instructor with a rotten belly. Crew was Gunner George Francis Devlin, and the radio man was Walter Reed Parpart Jr. FT-36 had Captain Edward Joseph Powers, with crew Gunner Sergeant Howell Orrin Thompson and radio man Sergeant George Richard Peonesa. FT-3 had pilot Ensign Joseph Tipton Bossy and crew Gunner Herman Arthur Thelander and radio man Bert E. Ballack. FT-117 had the Master Chief. Just kidding. The pilot was Captain George William Stivers Jr., the crew were Gunner Sergeant Robert Francis Gallivan, and the radio man was Private Robert Peter Grubel. Then finally, FT-81 was Second Lieutenant Forrest James Gerber, and the crew was Private First Class William Lightfoot with the radio man Corporal Alan Costner, who was excused from the exercise and lived to be almost 98. He died a couple years ago in 2021. Phantom tax, I guess. The first 90 minutes of the flight proceeded as normal. The aircraft successfully reached Hen and Chicken Shoals for their bombing practice, then made a quick detour to a Burger King with their student pilots returning to the shoals to drop their ordnance on target. They continued east as planned, then turned north for the second leg of their triangular route, and it was here, somewhere over the Bahamas, that Lieutenant Taylor's spatial orientation began to fail catastrophically. His belly hurt super bad at this point. And at the same time Flight 19 was in the air, so was another senior flight instructor, Lieutenant Robert F. Cox, under the call sign FT-74. And FT-74 reportedly overheard communications between 2 members of Flight 19, not knowing who it was at the time. One pilot was asking another for a compass reading, and the responding said, "I don't know where we are. We must have gotten lost after that last turn." The pilots in this transmission were Lieutenant Taylor and Captain Powers. FT-74 then relayed to Fort Lauderdale that he'd overheard the crews of planes or boats that were lost. And eventually, FT-74 made contact with Lieutenant Taylor in FT-28 to ask what was wrong, with Taylor responding, "Both my compasses are out and I'm trying to find Fort Lauderdale, Florida. I am over land, but it is broken. I am sure I'm in the Keys, but I don't know how far down and I don't know how to get to Fort Lauderdale." This transmission revealed a fundamental error for Taylor. He believed the aircraft were over the Florida Keys, southwest of their base, when they were actually over the Bahamas to the east. and FT-74 shared how to get back, but the location mix-up was a big problem that wouldn't be discovered until after all of this happened. Lieutenant Taylor asked if Flight 19 was on radar, and FT-74 asked if their IFF, their identification friend or foe, one of their instruments was switched on, but it was not. That would have helped with radar. The situation deteriorated rapidly as ground stations attempted to assist this lost flight. And Air Sea Rescue Task Unit 4 was monitoring communications from the Port Everglades. Naval Air Station Miami was trying to get a fix on Flight 19. Merchant ships were notified, and the Coast Guard were ready to dispatch. Lieutenant Taylor, completely lost and confused, even speculated they may have been over the Gulf of Mexico and communicated that he would fly 45 minutes, 030 degrees, but changed course only 7 minutes later to 090, which further complicated the situation. FT-74, trying to catch up to Flight 19, following Lieutenant Taylor's communication that they were over the Keys, headed towards that reported location where the signal only got weaker, which confirmed that they were over the Bahamas. As you can see from the map, those are two different places. Students could even be overheard in transmissions trying to talk sense to Lieutenant Taylor's. Damn it, if we could just fly west, we could get home. Head west, damn it, they were reported as saying. Although, if both of Taylor's compasses were out, maybe theirs were too, and maybe they were simply communicating that they were in fact east of where they needed to go and they just needed to go west. They weren't sure how to get west. Doesn't the sun set in the west? I don't know how that works in an airplane. I'm not sure if you can see that maybe the Earth's flat. I don't know, dude. Antarctica, Epstein's List, all this stuff. What in the fuck? The students could have had working compasses and were maybe attempting to communicate the direction to Taylor, but when a rescue unit, ASRTU-4, suggested that a plane with a working compass take the lead, no other plane did take the lead, and they still were lost forever. Ground controllers at Fort Lauderdale made repeated attempts to establish Flight 19's position. All of them unfortunately failed. They instructed Taylor to switch to the search and rescue frequency and activate his YG homing transmitter, which would allow them to triangulate his location, but Taylor had declined, fearing that by switching, he may lose contact with the rest of Flight 19. Light and fuel were burning as the day progressed, and it was only a matter of time before one or the other ran out. And sunset that day was reportedly around 5:30 p.m. since it was the beginning of December and days are obviously shorter in December. Plus the ocean below them, the waters were only getting rougher as the day progressed, with whitecaps reported being visible from the air. By 6:20 p.m., Flight 19 was still in the air, but only barely. The last transmission from Lieutenant Taylor of FT-28 was captured. All planes close up tight. We'll have to ditch unless landfall. When the first plane drops below 10 gallons, we all go down together. That is unbelievable. It's an order that all 5 aircraft would ditch simultaneously when the first ran out of fuel, which is haunting. It's very haunting, and it reflects military cohesion and a tragic level of inevitability. And ditching a TBM Avenger in calm seas was dangerous, but this was obviously far from that. Attempting to ditch at night in stormy waters with a heavy swell in a plane with a tendency to nose over on water impact made this almost certainly fatal to the crews of Flight 19. Additionally, the Avengers of Flight 19 had taken off with enough fuel for 5 hours of flight time, which they were eating into by this point. And by 6:20, they had been airborne for over 4 hours, and after 6:20, only occasional carrier wave signals were detected from Flight 19, which grew progressively weaker until they faded entirely. The sudden silence marked the presumed moment when 5 aircraft carrying 14 men slipped beneath the waves and crashed. The disappearance of Flight 19 triggered one of the largest peacetime search and rescue operations in American history. Within hours, aircraft from multiple bases were airborne, including 2 PBM Mariner flying boats diverted from training flights. The Training Mariner, designated Training 49, departed NAS Banana River at 1927 with a crew of 13 and was tasked with searching the area where Flight 19 was believed to have gone down. Just 3 minutes after takeoff, Training 49 transmitted a routine position report, and it would be their last communication as well. At 2115 or 9:15 p.m., the tanker SS Gaines Mills reported observing a burst of flames, apparently an explosion, leaping flames 100 feet high and burning for 10 minutes at this position. No survivors were ever found. So the loss of Flight 19 with the loss of the PBM Mariner with all hands transformed an already tragic incident into a literal catastrophe. The 13 additional deaths brought the day's toll to 27 lost aviators. The search effort over the following 5 days dramatically expanded and eventually encompassed 250 250 to 300,000 square miles of ocean, land, and swamp, thanks to the crews of nearly 300 planes and boats. But despite all of that, despite this unprecedented effort, the largest air-sea search in Florida history, not a single piece of wreckage from Flight 19 was ever conclusively identified. Search planes flew grid patterns over the Atlantic, the Gulf of Mexico, and Florida mainland. They investigated every reported oil slick and debris field, and ground parties combed the Everglades and coastal areas and found absolutely nothing. It was a tragic mystery of epic proportion, and the mythology from this added to the mythology and legend of the Bermuda Triangle, obviously, given its location. But the mythology of Flight 19 reached its definitive form in February of 1964 when Vincent Gaddis published The Deadly Bermuda Triangle in Argosy magazine. This article is what legitimately sparked the Bermuda Triangle phenomenon. This coined a term that would become synonymous with maritime mystery and become the de facto explanation for any disappearance in the region. Normal, acceptable, or anomalous. But it's very important to acknowledge that the Bermuda Triangle is not the only area where planes or boats go missing. It's just a normal thing, okay? It's just a thing that happens. Of course, these unsolved disappearances are very abnormal. They're strange, but statistically, in regards to the Bermuda Triangle, it's normal, all right? Methinks! The point is, the Bermuda Triangle does not have a monopoly on fascinating and tragic disappearances. One of the most notable and interesting disappearances in history is both modern and across the globe from the Bermuda Triangle. It is Malaysian flight MH370. This is the same flight related to this absolutely unbelievable video of an airplane flying with orbs, rotating around it, and then in a zip, it disappears. You may have seen that. It is a huge, very popular conspiracy on Twitter, formerly known as X, and it's fantastical and ridiculous and unbelievable, to be honest. So we have to start with the real story. In the pre-dawn darkness of March 8th, 2014, 227 passengers filed aboard a Boeing 777 at Kuala Lumpur International Airport, all bound for Beijing. Among them were 20 employees from Texas-based Freescale Semiconductor, a group of Chinese calligraphy artists returning from an exhibition, and Paul Weeks, who had left his watch and wedding ring at home in case anything happened. None of these people would reach their destination, and what began as a routine flight, the MH370 mystery has become aviation's most perplexing mystery, with still no conclusive evidence being found of what exactly happened to it, despite sparking the largest and most advanced and most expensive search in American human history. The Malaysian Airlines Boeing 777 was an 11-year-old workhorse with an impeccable safety record, unlike modern Boeings. At the controls sat Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah, a 53-year-old man with 18,365 flight hours, the absolute definition of a veteran. And on top of that, he was a passionate flight sim user. So this guy was as good as it gets. Beside this Jedi master was First Officer Farik Abdul Hamid, a 27-year-old man on his first flight as a fully certified Boeing 777 pilot. The weather was perfect, with clear skies, calm winds, excellent visibility, and at 12:41 a.m. local time, MH370 pushed back from the gate 6 minutes behind schedule. Nothing suggested this departure would be different from the aircraft's previous 7,500 takeoffs, totaling over 53,000 hours in air. Unbelievable amount of travel, impeccable safety record. This was a safe plane. The flight proceeded as per usual for its first hour, and at 1:01 a.m., the MH370 reached its cruising altitude of 35,000 feet, heading northeast across the South China Sea towards Vietnam. 6 minutes later, the Aircraft Communications Addressing and Reporting System, the ACARS, transmitted routine data showing 43,800 kilograms of fuel remaining, which was absolutely enough for the remaining journey to Beijing. At 1:19 a.m., as the aircraft approached the boundary between the Malaysian and Vietnamese airspace, Kuala Lumpur Air Traffic Control made a routine handoff. They were quoted as saying, "Malaysian 370, contact Ho Chi Minh 120.9, good night." This transmission from Malaysian Air Control instructed MH370 to switch radio frequencies to Vietnamese air control. The response came back immediately from the cockpit of the 370. "Good night, Malaysian 370. It was a simple and standard response from the cockpit saying good night from the crew of the MH370. And these 5 words would be the last anyone heard from the MH370. Ho Chi Minh, standing by to receive contact from MH370 headed to Beijing, never received any contact from the flight. And within 2 minutes, the aircraft's transponder, which broadcasts identity and altitude to air traffic control, went dark. The plane vanished from civilian radar screens as if it had simply ceased to exist. Several attempts from Ho Chi Minh to get a response from the 370 went totally unanswered, and the transponder going dark would logically only result from damage or an intentional disabling. And with clear skies, damage seemed unlikely, but why would Captain Shah or First Officer Hamid turn the transponder off? It doesn't really make sense. And while the plane was no longer visible to air traffic control towers or civilians who may have been tracking the flight from home or its transponder signal, at around 2:15 a.m., Malaysian military radar picked up a signal that was later confirmed to be the MH370. The flight had diverted far from its intended route and made a sharp turn westward, headed almost back the direction that it had come from. It had flown back southwest past the Malay Peninsula, the Kuala Lumpur International Airport, and over the Malacca Strait. And for crucial hours, as the aircraft flew on in radio silence, authorities searched in the wrong ocean, based of course upon their expected route. Searches focused on the South China Sea, not the Indian Ocean, where the MH370 had changed course to. And while the disabled transponder prevented the MH370 from transmitting location, altitude, and speed data to ground radar, another system on the plane was still optional: the Aircraft Communications Addressing and Reporting System, ACARS. It's a system that allows pilots to send basic messages through radio signals and satellite. It is a more complex system to disable, requiring a series of cockpit switches to be flipped, some computer use, and access to a hard-to-reach electrical panel. The ACARS for the MH370 was not shut off and continued to receive and send signals for 6 hours after communications ceased between the cockpit and air traffic control towers. Inmarsat, a British satellite telecommunications company, was able to capitalize on the ACARS system to receive hourly pings from the MH370 through log-on requests, also known as Inmarsat handshakes. Aircraft will automatically respond to these handshakes to indicate the system is still active, thus completing the handshake. An Inmarsat station located in Perth, Australia, performed 6 complete handshakes with the MH370, with the last one being recorded at around 8:15 a.m., almost 7 hours after the transponder was shut off. While these handshakes contained no location data, Inmarsat tracked the change in the signal frequency relative to their satellite, which is the same way that the Doppler effect works for radar. They use this to determine the potential paths it could have taken, with one over mainland Asia and one continuing southwest past Australia. At the time of the incomplete 7th attempted handshake, that was the same time when the plane's fuel would have been completely expended. So the plane was down, and it was a certainty. Tragically, search and rescue teams spent days searching for MH370 in the South China Sea, which is not where it went down by any means. They were searching where it would have made sense for it to go down given the route to Beijing. But by the time the data from Inmarsat was relayed to British authorities and then made to Malaysia, where it could have been reviewed and confirmed, over a week had passed, and on March 17th, the Malaysian government reached out to Australia asking for their assistance in the search, then taking over the area of the southern Indian Ocean where the plane may have strayed because it lay in the Australian search and rescue zone. When Malaysian Prime Minister Najib Razak announced on March 24th that the MH370 had ended in the southern Indian Ocean, the revelation was pretty confusing and shocking. I mean, how could a modern airliner fly for 7 hours after vanishing and the search take place in the wrong ocean? It seems unbelievable. The search pivoted dramatically, obviously, when this information first came out, from the South China Sea to the sea waters southwest of Australia, with Australia then fully in the lead. It's completely the opposite of how it started. The initial Australian-led underwater search covered more than 120,000 square kilometers of seafloor, with the total area searched being well over 200,000 square kilometers and costing the Australian government 200 million Australian dollars. The search never turned up anything. No wreckage, no debris, no bodies. They managed to find previously unknown shipwrecks, but nothing indicating the location of MH370. Then we fast forward a year. On July 29, 2015, beach cleaner Johnny Begu was collecting garbage along Reunion Island shore when he spotted something unusual: a barnacle-encrusted wing part nearly 2 meters long. He called law enforcement immediately, and it was recovered for inspection and eventually determined to be a piece of MH370. Pictures of the wing circulated, and Boeing workers believed it to belong to a 777 based upon a part number visible in pictures. The only missing 777 at that time was MH370, according to a US official. So after over 500 days, the first physical evidence crawled its way out of the sea. If debris could reach Reunion here, where else could the ocean have carried it? In February of 2016, Blaine Gibson, an American lawyer turned adventurer who dedicated his life to finding MH370 debris, would discover more than 20 pieces, becoming a one-man search operation himself. And by 2017, 43 pieces of debris had been found, with 18 confirmed as almost certainly from MH370. But the debris also deepened other mysteries. Barnacle growth patterns and ocean drift models helped scientists narrow the crash location to around 35 degrees south latitude. But when underwater search covered these areas, the main wreckage remained hidden. The ocean had returned fragments while keeping the full body of the MH370 secret. So with the plane never being recovered in full, theories of what happened in the final hours of MH370 are purely speculative. There are some wild theories. It is believed by many that this was an intentional tragedy, given the plane's transponder being turned off manually during the handoff between Malaysian and Vietnamese airspaces. Then the plane turning back around, flying back over the Malay Peninsula, which the pilot or co-pilot assumedly would have recognized and been able to course correct. It's a big piece because the plane flew over the Malaysian region of Penang, which is the pilot's home state, and it flew over the Indian Ocean and turned further south, the complete opposite direction it should have been going. So it's very confusing. Did this for a long time. It's bad. Obviously, I shouldn't have even said that probably. Sound like an idiot. Larry Vance, an air crash investigator, claims that the fact that a large piece of wing was recovered by Begg is indicative of a pilot-controlled impact, because planes that crash into water usually break into many tiny fragments, but this large piece tells a different story. Vance theorizes that it was deliberately ditched, crashed into the ocean. Whether it was deliberately crashed, though, or a deliberate attempt to save those aboard, that's all debatable. But with Danica Weeks, the wife of Paul Weeks, who was on board the MH370, believing it to be murder. Horrifying, scary, and speculative. We will never know what exactly happened. Well, hopefully we will know with MH370 at some point, but so far, there is video of orbs flying around it, and that's just for a totally other video to investigate that. It's not just mechanical failure, it's not just human error, it is a grandiose reminder that it is possible to just disappear from existence, and people never figure out why. That was this video. That's what this video was about. It's humbling, I guess. Sad, tragic, whatever you want to call it. Anyways, thank you guys for watching. If you enjoyed, press the like button, and I'll see you in the next one.